probably think of vitamin D as, the calcium molecule.
Right, the bone builder.
Exactly. It's that thing your parents always told you to drink in fortified milk to build strong bones and teeth. Or, like, the vitamin that prevents rickets.
Yeah, that's the classic textbook story.
We've all been handed this very simple, very binary narrative since we were kids. But what if I told you that this neat little story is hiding one of the most astonishing biological realities of the human body?
It really is.
What if I told you that this basic bone-building molecule is actually, well, a master switch for your entire immune system?
It completely upends how we look at human health. I mean, we're currently living through an unprecedented global epidemic of allergic diseases.
Yeah, it's everywhere now.
Asthma, atopic dermatitis, life-threatening food allergies. The rates are absolutely skyrocketing across the industrialized world.
It's terrifying for parents, especially.
Absolutely. But when you overlay the epidemiological maps of this allergy explosion, it matches up almost flawlessly with a quiet, creeping pandemic of vitamin D insufficiency. So today, we're going to connect the dots between those two massive trends.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because as someone who loves learning how our bodies actually tick, the stack of sources we've gathered for this deep dive completely blew my mind.
There's some incredible data in there.
Yeah, we have these incredibly comprehensive medical reviews, cutting-edge pediatric immunology papers, dermatological research. So our mission for you today is to strip away the assumptions. We need to get down to the microscopic biological mechanisms.
Right down to the cellular level.
We're going to explore exactly how this so-called sunshine hormone dictates whether your body successfully fights off a dangerous viral infection or whether it completely loses the plot, goes into hyperdrive, and launches a massive attack against, like, a harmless peanut or pollen or even your own skin tissue.
And to really grasp how this molecule either fixes or fuels those allergic reactions, we have to throw out the idea of vitamin D as just a simple supplement you swallow with breakfast.
Right. It's not just a pill.
No, we have to look at the manufacturing plant inside you. We need to trace how your body actually acquires, alters, and deploys this compound because it's an incredibly intricate, multi-stage process.
I love looking at the body as a factory. So let's trace the journey of this molecule on the assembly line because, like you said, it isn't just one step.
Not at all.
The biology of vitamin D is essentially a multi-step activation process. Let's start at step one, which actually happens on the surface of your body.
Right.
You walk outside and the sun hits your skin. Specifically, we're talking about ultraviolet B radiation, or UVB. What is physically happening at a molecular level in that fraction of a second when the sunlight actually strikes you?
It's a remarkable piece of evolutionary engineering, honestly. When those invisible UVB photons penetrate the outer layers of your epidermis, they strike a very specific precursor molecule that's just, sitting there in your skin cells.
Just waiting.
Exactly. This molecule is called 7-dehydrocholesterol. It's essentially a type of cholesterol. And when the UV light hits it, the raw energy of that photon physically breaks a specific carbon ring, the B ring within the molecule structure.
Wait, so the light is literally shattering a piece of the molecule to change its shape?
Exactly. It cleaves the ring open, and that brief, violent interaction transforms the 7-dehydrocholesterol into a new compound called pre-vitamin D3.
Pre-vitamin D3. Okay.
But here's the fascinating part. It still isn't ready to do anything useful. It's highly unstable.
So what does it need to stabilize?
In order to become stable, it requires the ambient thermal energy of your body. The physical heat of your skin causes this pre-vitamin D3 to undergo a rapid conformational shift.
It twists.
Yeah, it twists and rearranges its molecular shape to become vitamin D3, which scientists call cholecalciferol.
Okay, so step one requires both the energy of the sun to break the bond and the warmth of the body to mold the shape.
Yeah.
And now we have cholecalciferol.
Right.
But even after all that, we are still nowhere near the active master switch that controls your immune system, are we? This raw material has to go on like a systemic road trip.
That's right. It seeps out of your skin cells and into your capillary beds, entering the bloodstream. But it's a fat-soluble molecule, so it can't just float freely in your watery blood.
It would just separate, like oil and water.
Exactly. It needs a transport vehicle. So it binds to a specialized carrier protein called the vitamin D binding protein, or VDBP.
Okay, VDBP.
Think of VDBP as a molecular taxicab. It picks up the cholecalciferol and drives it straight to your liver. That brings us to step 2 of the manufacturing process.
So we arrive at the liver. What happens inside this massive organ to enter the molecule further?
Once inside the liver, the molecule encounters a very specific enzyme called 25-hydroxylase. If we look at its exact genetic name, it's CYP27A1.
CYP27A1.
Got it. Now, a hydroxyl group is just an oxygen atom bonded to a hydrogen atom. This enzyme acts like a welder, attaching a single hydroxyl group onto the 25th carbon position of the cholecalciferol molecule.
So it's adding a new attachment.
Yeah, and this newly welded molecule is now called 25-hydroxyvitamin D, or simply 25-OHD.
I want to pause right there, 25-OHD. Because for anyone listening who has ever gone to their doctor complaining of, I don't know, fatigue or seasonal depression, and the doctor says, let's check your vitamin D levels, this is the exact molecule they're measuring in your blood work, right?
That's a crucial point. Yes, when you look at your lab results, you are looking at your 25-OHD levels.
But why measure the middleman?
The reason doctors measure this specific intermediary stage and not the raw stuff from the sun or the final active hormone is because 25-OHD has a long half-life in the blood, roughly 2 to 3 weeks.
Oh, so it sticks around.
It's highly stable, so it gives your doctor a very reliable, steady picture of your overall vitamin D storage tank. It tells us how much raw material your factory has stockpiled.
That makes sense. But even though it's what we measure, it's still not the boss. It's not the hormone that actually talks to your DNA. To get to that final potent form, the molecule has to get back in the taxi cab and travel to step 3.
Which has traditionally always been understood to be the kidneys. Your kidneys are the central processing plant for the final product.
Okay, into the kidneys we go.
Inside the kidneys, a second enzyme takes over. This one is called 1-alpha-hydroxylase, or CYP27B1.
So B1 instead of A1.
Exactly. This enzyme welds one final hydroxyl group onto the first carbon position, and that final modification changes everything. The molecule is now 1025-dihydroxyvitamin D, otherwise known as calcitriol.
Calcitriol. So this is the fully active, wildly potent steroid hormone.
Yes.
This is the master key that can physically enter the nucleus of your cells, bind to the vitamin D receptor, and actively turn your genes on and off.
It is the ultimate endpoint of the traditional textbook pathway skin to liver to kidneys, and then pumped back out into the blood to regulate calcium and bone density.
So that's the textbook plumbing we've all been taught. But here's where it gets incredibly fascinating. And honestly, this was the biggest revelation for me when I was going through the source material.
Yeah, it's a huge paradigm shift.
We always thought the kidneys held a monopoly on that final activation step. We thought they were the only ones with the CYP27B1 enzyme. But the data shows that our immune cells, the very microscopic soldiers fighting off infections and triggering allergies, they can do this too.
This discovery completely shattered our understanding of immunology. For decades, the medical community assumed immune cells were entirely dependent on the kidneys to supply them with active calcitriol from the bloodstream.
Like waiting for a supply drop.
Right. But researchers eventually discovered that immune cells, specifically macrophages and dendritic cells, which are the sentinels that patrol your tissues looking for invaders, actually express both of those activating enzymes, CYP27A1 and CYP27B1, all by themselves.
Oh, wait, let me make sure I'm visualizing the magnitude of this correctly. So you're telling me these immune cells aren't just passive foot soldiers waiting for a centralized command in the kidneys to mail them their supplies.
Nope.
They actually carry their own portable processing plants. They can grab the inactive raw 25-OHD floating by in the blood and activate it into calcitriol right there on the front lines in the middle of a tissue injury or an allergic reaction.
That is the exact mechanism. They have the complete molecular machinery to synthesize active calcitriol locally. In biology, we call this an autocrine or paracrine function.
Autocrine and paracrine.
Autocrine means the cell makes the hormone to regulate itself. Paracrine means it makes it to influence the cells immediately surrounding it.
Oh, I see.
This means your immune system can mount a localized, lightning-fast response, fine-tuning its own inflammation levels without having to wait for your systemic kidney hormone levels to adjust.
That is just brilliant biological design. But think about what the dark side of that implies for you, the listener.
Yeah.
Let's say you're living a modern indoor life, and your blood levels of the raw material, that 25-OHD your doctor checks, are profoundly low.
Right, which is so common.
When an allergen enters your body, your immune cells arrive at the battlefield with their portable processing plants, ready to manufacture the master switch to regulate themselves. But they open the warehouse doors, and there's no raw material. The supply chain is completely broken.
It leaves the immune cell totally stranded. And without that localized production of active vitamin D to hit the brakes, the immune system is highly prone to massive overreactions.
Now, this just freaks out.
It panics. The inflammation spirals out of control. Which naturally brings us to the core question: what exactly does this active vitamin D tell the immune cells to do when the system is actually working?
Right. What are the actual orders being barked out?
Because the literature describes it functioning almost like an elite traffic cop, barking orders to both the fast-acting innate immune system and the slower, highly specialized adaptive immune system.
I want to break both of those down, starting with the innate immune system. For anyone who isn't an immunologist, these are your body's first responders.
The front line.
When you get a paper cut, or when you breathe in a massive cloud of dust mites while cleaning your attic, these are the cells that rush to the site immediately. How does our vitamin D traffic cop direct these guys?
Let's look at the primary tripwire of the innate immune system, which are called toll-like receptors, or TLRs. You'll find these microscopic receptors covering the surface of monocytes and macrophages.
Okay, toll-like receptors.
When a dangerous bacteria or an allergen that the body mistakes for a dangerous bacteria bumps into one of these TLRs, it triggers a massive alarm cascade inside the cell.
The alarms go off.
Exactly. The cell begins pumping out inflammatory chemicals to scorch the earth and destroy the invader.
Which is fantastic if you're fighting off a literal staph infection, but an absolute nightmare if you're just breathing in some harmless tree pollen.
Precisely. You don't want that cellular alarm ringing indefinitely. When active vitamin D is present in the tissue, it physically suppresses the expression of these toll-like receptors on the monocytes.
It turns them off.
It pulls down the antennas. By reducing the number of tripwires, it fundamentally lowers the sensitivity of the entire innate immune system, ensuring the inflammatory fire doesn't rage out of control.
So it's actively dampening the alarm system. But it goes deeper than that because it actually changes the very nature and behavior of the cells themselves. The sources detail this phenomenon called macrophage polarization, which honestly sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie.
It really does. Macrophage polarization is one of the most elegant displays of cellular decision-making we know of. A macrophage isn't just one thing. It can physically shift between different phenotypes or states, depending on what the local environment demands.
Like a transformer.
Basically, yeah. When a macrophage is in the M1 phenotype, it is essentially in attack mode. It's highly pro-inflammatory. It secretes aggressive, toxic chemical signals like tumor necrosis factor alpha, or TNF-alpha, and interleukin-12, or IL-12.
I picture the M1 macrophage as a SWAT team kicking down a door. They are throwing flashbangs, tearing up the drywall, screaming for backup. They are causing massive collateral tissue damage just to neutralize a threat.
That's an incredibly accurate way to view it. But once the threat is neutralized, you can't leave the SWAT team in the house forever. That's where the M2 phenotype comes in.
The M2.
The M2 macrophage is the exact opposite. It's the medic and the cleanup crew. It is highly anti-inflammatory. It produces soothing, resolving chemical signals like interleukin-10 or IL-10 and transforming growth factor beta or TGF-beta.
So it's calming things down.
Exactly. The M cytokines tell the surrounding tissue, the war is over. Let's rebuild the blood vessels, sweep up the dead cells, and heal the wound.
And vitamin D is the dispatcher making this call.
Yes. Active vitamin D operates directly on the macrophage to force a phenotypic shift. It actively downregulates the aggressive M1 state and polarizes the cell to transition into the peaceful, healing M2 state.
It's literally forcing the cell to put down its weapons and pick up a broom. That is wild. But the innate immune system has other players besides macrophages.
It does.
The sources specifically highlight eosinophils. Now, if you or your child has ever dealt with severe chronic asthma or severe eczema, your doctor has definitely talked to you about eosinophils. They are these specialized white blood cells that seem to be the primary villains in causing severe allergic tissue damage. What is vitamin D doing to them?
To understand why eosinophils are so dangerous in an allergic reaction, you have to know what they carry. Inside an eosinophil are granules packed with highly destructive toxic proteins.
Like little grenades.
Exactly. Two of the worst offenders are major basic protein, or MBP, and eosinophil cationic protein, ECP. When an eosinophil degranulates, meaning it dumps these toxic proteins into your lung tissue during an asthma attack or into your skin during an eczema flare-up, it liquefies the surrounding tissue.
Oh, wow. Liquefies it.
It causes immense physical damage and hyperreactivity.
It's essentially chemical warfare inside your own airways.
It is. Now, vitamin D intervenes against eosinophils in two very distinct ways. First, it chemically inhibits the eosinophil from releasing those toxic proteins. It jams the release mechanism, effectively disarming the bomb.
Okay, that's huge.
But the second action is even more fascinating. Vitamin D upregulates a very specific receptor on the outer membrane of the eosinophil called CXCR4.
Okay, let's decode that. What does upregulating CXCR4 actually achieve?
CXCR4 acts like a navigational homing beacon. By forcing the eosinophil to display more of these receptors, vitamin D gives the cell a new set of GPS coordinates.
It redirects them.
Yes. It chemically directs the eosinophil to migrate away from the site of the allergic inflammation. It forces them to move out into non-inflammatory tissues or guides them toward apoptosis, which is the cell's programmed self-destruct sequence.
So the traffic cop isn't just taking away their weapons, it's physically waving them out of the crowded intersection and telling them to go home or self-destruct. That is incredibly powerful.
It's a massive regulatory lever.
But while it's doing all of this suppression and downregulation, it's actually building up our physical defenses simultaneously. The research heavily features these things called antimicrobial peptides, or AMPs.
Yes, and particularly a potent class of AMPs known as cathelicidins. Your skin and the epithelial cells lining your lungs are the primary physical walls protecting you from the outside world. They are your castle walls.
Right.
When these epithelial cells are exposed to active vitamin D, it triggers a genetic pathway that causes them to manufacture these cathelicidins. You can think of cathelicidins as natural endogenous antibiotics.
Endogenous meaning made inside the body.
Exactly. When an invading bacteria tries to colonize the skin or the lung tissue, these peptides instantly puncture the bacterial cell walls, killing them on contact.
So it suppresses the overactive alarm system while simultaneously reinforcing the actual structural integrity of the wall.
Correct.
This is so crucial because in so many allergic conditions, it's the physical breakdown of the barrier that lets the pollen or the peanut protein in to begin with.
It's a masterful dual action. But as comprehensive as that is, we've only covered the innate immune system, the fast responders.
Right, there's a whole other half to this.
To really understand allergies, we have to look at the adaptive immune system.
Okay.
These are the highly specialized, highly trained forces, the T cells and the B cells that maintain specific long-term memories of particular allergens.
Let's get into it.
Yeah.
How does the master switch manage these specialized T cells?
It exerts a profoundly suppressive effect on the specific branches of the adaptive system that drive chronic inflammation. Namely, it aggressively inhibits the proliferation of T helper 1 cells, or Th1, and T helper 17 cells, Th17.
Th1 and Th17, are those the bad guys?
In the clinical world, Th1 and Th17 cells are notorious. They are the primary drivers of massive tissue damage in autoimmune diseases and severe late-stage allergic reactions. Vitamin D essentially cuts their supply lines and stops them from replicating.
Again, it doesn't just destroy, it replaces.
Right. It replaces them with the peacekeepers. The sources call them regulatory T cells, or FOXP3 plus TREGs.
FOXP3 plus TREGs.
The FOXP3 plus TREGs are arguably the most important cells in your entire immune system when it comes to preventing allergies. Their entire existence is dedicated to enforcing something called immune tolerance.
Immune tolerance, meaning they teach the body to chill out.
Exactly. They patrol your bloodstream and tissues, constantly secreting that soothing cytokine we mentioned earlier, interleukin-10. This IL-10 bathes the surrounding immune cells and commands them to ignore harmless environmental proteins.
So if you have enough of these, you don't react to peanuts.
If you have a robust, active population of TREGs, you don't develop allergies. And vitamin D is one of the most potent known stimulators of FOXP3 plus TREG induction and function.
And it doesn't ignore the B cells either, right? The B cells are the factories that actually produce the allergy antibodies.
Exactly. When a B cell gets the signal that an allergen is present, it morphs into a plasma cell and begins pumping out immunoglobulin E, or IgE.
And IgE is the classic allergy antibody.
It's the missile that locks onto allergens. Vitamin D physically inhibits the formation of these memory B cells and plasma cells. By suppressing the factories, it drastically reduces the total amount of IgE floating around in your blood, lowering your overall allergic sensitization.
Okay, I get to push back here, because I was reading the source notes on this adaptive system extremely carefully, and I found a massive, glaring contradiction that we really need to unpack.
Okay, let's hear it.
We just talked about how vitamin D suppresses Th1, suppresses Th17, suppresses B cells, and pumps up the TREG peacekeepers. But the research also clearly states that in some experimental models, vitamin D actually stimulates Th2 cells.
Yes. Yes.
And isn't the Th2 pathway the exact specific immune pathway that causes classical allergies like asthma and hay fever? How can a master switch that prevents allergies be actively promoting the pathway that causes them?
It's a brilliant question, and it is a paradox that caused a tremendous amount of confusion in the immunology community for a long time. You are absolutely correct. Traditional allergic diseases are classically defined as Th2-driven conditions.
Right.
The Th2 cells produce cytokines like IL-4, IL-5, and IL-13, which recruit those destructive eosinophils and drive IgE production. And it is true that in certain isolated in vitro models, meaning we take immune cells out of a human, put them in a plastic petri dish, and drop vitamin D on them, we sometimes see an upregulation of those Th2 cytokines.
So if it stimulates the allergy pathway in the dish, why doesn't giving someone a vitamin D supplement just make their allergies instantly worse?
Because the immune system inside a living human being is not a plastic petri dish. It is a wildly complex, multidimensional ecosystem.
It's not operating in a vacuum.
Exactly. What we have to evaluate is the net overriding effect of vitamin D in vivo, meaning inside the living, breathing body. The immune system is constantly striving for balance.
Balance is key.
While vitamin D might gently preserve or stimulate some Th2 activity under specific conditions to ensure we don't completely lose our defense against parasites, which is what the Th2 system originally evolved to fight. Its overwhelming dominant systemic effect is the massive proliferation of those FOXP3+ tregs and the sweeping suppression of IgE from the B cells.
Ah, I see. So it's a numbers game. The peacekeepers just completely flood the zone and outnumber the instigator.
That's the exact mechanism. By saturating the tissue microenvironment with IL-10 from the tregs and those M2 macrophages, vitamin D forces the entire biological system into a state of hyperresponsiveness.
Hyperresponsiveness.
The tolerance signals are simply too loud. Even if a handful of Th2 cells manage to get activated, their inflammatory signals are completely drowned out by the overwhelming command to remain peaceful. The net result, the final biological equation, is a protected, non-reactive immune barrier.
That makes so much more sense when you look at it as a whole ecosystem instead of an isolated pathway. The traffic cop isn't just stopping individual cars, it's redesigning the entire highway system so that a traffic jam is mathematically impossible.
Great analogy.
So let's take this microscopic traffic control out of the abstract theory and see how it plays out in the very real, very physical world. And the most logical place to start is the body's largest organ, your skin.
The skin is our primary interface with the environment, and it is the starting line for what immunologists call the atopic march.
Let's talk about the atopic march, because it's a terrifying progression for parents to watch. It usually starts in infancy with severe eczema or atopic dermatitis.
Right.
Then, a year or two later, the child suddenly develops severe food allergies. By the time they're in grade school, it progresses to allergic rhinitis or hay fever. And finally, it culminates in chronic asthma.
It's a relentless march from the outside of the body to the inside.
And the gateway for this entire nightmare is a failure of the skin.
Yes. Atopic dermatitis, or AD, is astonishingly common. It affects roughly 15 to 20% of the global pediatric population. It's characterized by intensely itchy, red, weeping, scaling patches of skin, often on the cheeks of infants or inside the elbows and behind the knees of older children.
But it's so painful.
It is. But visually, what you are looking at is a structurally broken epidermal barrier.
The sources describe it beautifully. If you picture healthy skin as a tightly mortared brick wall, atopic dermatitis is a wall where someone forgot to mix the mortar.
That mortar is heavily reliant on a specific structural protein called filigrin, which literally binds the keratinocytes, the skin cells, together. In AD patients, this filigrin is often genetically deficient or structurally compromised.
So the bricks are loose.
Because the barrier is broken and the bricks are loose, two catastrophic things happen. First, essential moisture rapidly escapes the body, leading to the chronic, painful dryness. Second, microscopic environmental allergens, pollen, dust, pet dander, and dangerous pathogens can easily slip between the cracks, penetrating deep into the sensitive tissues where the immune system is waiting.
And one of the most vicious pathogens that takes advantage of this broken wall is a bacteria called Staphylococcus aureus. The sources highlight that Staph aureus just aggressively colonizes these open, broken patches of eczema and drives the immune system absolutely crazy.
This is exactly where vitamin D's ability to induce those antimicrobial peptides, the catalycidins, becomes a matter of tissue survival.
The natural antibiotics.
Right. Clinical studies clearly show that active vitamin D directly binds to the receptors in the skin cells and commands them to manufacture massive amounts of catalycidins. These peptides hunt down and physically rupture the Staph aureus bacteria.
So it's clearing the infection.
By aggressively reducing the bacterial infection burden on the surface, vitamin D gives the skin barrier a brief window of peace to begin manufacturing the mortar, healing the cracks, and restoring its structural integrity.
The statistics linking this mechanism to real-world suffering are absolutely staggering. I want to look closely at the numbers from one of the major studies in our stack today, the Wang study.
That's a pivotal paper.
The researchers looked at a cohort of 498 children suffering from atopic dermatitis. Let's just put 500 kids in a room in our minds. If you have a random classroom of kids with eczema, you would expect some variation in their health markers. But Wang found that 37.8% of these suffering children were flat out severely vitamin D deficient.
And it gets worse.
Right. Another 41% had insufficient levels.
Those numbers are incredibly revealing. It means that out of nearly 500 children dealing with this agonizing sleep-destroying skin condition, only a meager 11.2% had normal, sufficient levels of vitamin D circulating in their blood.
Only 11%. That's wild.
That goes far beyond a mere coincidence. It is a glaring statistical signal suggesting that the fundamental absence of this immune master switch is a primary driver of the disease's severity.
And we know it's not just an observational fluke because the sources show what happens when researchers actually intervene. When doctors give these deficient patients vitamin D supplements, the results are highly measurable using something called the SCORAD index.
The SCORAD index, which stands for Scoring of Atopic Dermatitis, is the gold standard clinical tool dermatologists use to objectively measure the severity, surface area, and intensity of eczema on a patient's body.
So it's a standardized test.
Yes. Multiple randomized controlled trials have tracked this metric. When patients with AD are supplemented with vitamin D to successfully correct their underlying deficiency, there are highly significant, measurable reductions in their SCORAD scores.
So the skin actually clears up.
The relentless itching decreases, the angry redness fades, the weeping lesions dry up, and the epidermal barrier physically begins to function again.
That is life-changing for a family dealing with severe AD. Now that's atopic dermatitis. But there's an entirely different type of skin allergy mentioned in our research stack, contact dermatitis.
Right, a different mechanism.
This is when you brush up against some poison ivy, or you get a blistering rash from the nickel used in a cheap watch band. Biologically, this is a very different beast, isn't it? The sources classify it as a type IV hypersensitivity reaction.
It operates on a completely different timeline and mechanism. Atopic dermatitis is heavily driven by those IgE antibodies and the immediate fast-acting Th2 response. Contact dermatitis is a delayed type cellular hypersensitivity.
Delayed type.
It doesn't rely on antibodies. It relies almost entirely on T cells that have been previously sensitized to a very specific chemical or heavy metal. When your skin is re-exposed to that nickel or that plant oil, those memory T cells slowly migrate to the area and launch a localized, highly destructive inflammatory attack roughly 48 to 72 hours later.
Now, I found a deeply fascinating, almost bizarre detail in the sources regarding contact dermatitis.
Oh, the mouse study.
Yes. The researchers were using a mouse model to explore how vitamin D levels impact the severity of the rash. And the data showed that treating a vitamin D deficiency only produced a protective healing effect for the male mice. It completely failed to provide any significant protective effect for the female mice.
It's a very strange finding.
What on earth is happening there? Are we looking at some kind of weird hormonal crossover?
It's one of those findings that raises more questions than it answers, but it highlights how rudimentary our understanding of holistic biology still is. It is highly probable that we are witnessing a complex intersection between localized vitamin D metabolism and circulating sex hormones like estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone.
So the hormones are interfering with the receptors.
The genetic background, the gender genetics, and the specific hormonal profile of the individual likely dictate how efficiently the vitamin D receptor is expressed or how powerfully those CYP enzymes function within specific localized tissues.
Fascinating.
Even though this is an animal model, the implications for humans are profound. It suggests that in the future, personalized immunology, where we explicitly account for biological sex and hormonal status, might be strictly necessary when attempting to use vitamin D as a therapeutic tool for severe contact allergies.
It just goes to show that the body is not a simple plumbing system. It is a complex interacting ecosystem where pulling one lever might do something entirely different depending on the hormonal weather.
Well said.
Now, if vitamin D is this critical for protecting the outside physical barrier of your skin, well, what about the barrier we can't see? What about the skin on the inside of your body? Because your digestive tract is basically just an internal tube of skin.
The gastrointestinal tract is arguably the single most critical, high-stakes immune interface in the human body.
High stakes because of everything we eat.
Exactly. It has a massive surface area, entirely dedicated to the incredibly delicate task of absorbing microscopic nutrients while simultaneously keeping out a relentless tide of gut bacteria, environmental toxins, and large, unbroken allergenic food proteins.
And it has to sort the good from the bad constantly.
And just like the epidermis on your arm, the intestinal wall relies on microscopic architecture called tight junctions. These tight junctions act as the cellular mortar, locking the intestinal epithelial cells together to maintain a waterproof, impenetrable seal.
And when that seal fails, when those tight junctions break apart, we end up with the condition commonly known as leaky gut. How does vitamin D regulate this internal architecture?
The maintenance of those tight junction proteins is heavily regulated by the vitamin D receptor. Active vitamin D constantly signals the gut tissue to synthesize and reinforce these proteins.
So it's keeping the mortar fresh.
When a person is suffering from a profound vitamin D deficiency, the genetic production of those junction proteins dramatically drops. The mortar dissolves, the gut barrier becomes physically defective and highly permeable.
I want to visualize the exact sequence of a food allergy because it's terrifyingly mechanical. Let's say you have a leaky gut due to low vitamin D. You go to a party and you eat a handful of peanuts. In a healthy gut, the digestive enzymes break that peanut protein down into tiny, harmless individual amino acids before they cross the barrier. But because your gut is leaky, massive, completely intact, unbroken peanut proteins slip right through the microscopic cracks between your intestinal cells.
Right, they bypass the breakdown process.
They crash straight into the massive network of immune-rich tissues lying just beneath the gut lining. What happens the moment that intact protein breaches the wall?
The moment that intact peanut protein enters the submucosal tissue, it is instantly recognized as a hostile foreign invader. The localized dendritic cells, those sentinels we discussed earlier, grab the protein and present it to the adaptive immune system.
Like showing a wanted poster to the police.
Exactly. The T cells examine it, panic, and immediately instruct the B cells to start manufacturing massive quantities of specific IgE antibodies explicitly targeted to hunt down that exact shape of peanut protein.
So the body's arming itself.
Those millions of IgE antibodies are then pumped into your bloodstream, where they travel throughout your entire body and irreversibly attach themselves to the outside of your mast cells. Your body is now officially sensitized. The bomb is armed.
And the tragic part is, you might not even feel sick that day.
No, you wouldn't.
But the next time you eat a peanut, even a tiny fragment of one, those primed mast cells recognize it immediately, and they degranulate, they literally rupture, instantly dumping a catastrophic flood of histamine and inflammatory cytokines into your blood.
And that's when the symptoms hit.
That histamine is what causes the sudden hives, the facial swelling, the violent vomiting, the terrifying wheezing, and in the worst-case scenario, the systemic shock of full-blown anaphylaxis.
The entire terrifying, life-threatening cascade. And the data strongly suggests that the initial underlying trigger that allowed that first sensitization to occur was a structurally defective gut barrier, a barrier compromised by a simple lack of vitamin D during the highly critical windows of immune development in early infancy.
Which brings us to the Allen study from our sources. When I read the statistical risk factors in this paper, my jaw hit the floor.
It's a landmark study.
The researchers conducted a massive study looking at thousands of infants to track how early vitamin D deficiency impacted their lifetime risk of developing food allergies. The results should be front-page news. Infants who suffered from vitamin D deficiency were 6 times more prone to develop any food allergy overall compared to infants with sufficient levels. Let me repeat that. 6 times more likely.
It is a devastating statistic, but the data becomes even more stark and alarming when you break it down by specific, highly allergenic foods.
Right.
The deficient infants were 3 times more likely to develop an egg allergy. And the most shocking, the most profound statistic of the entire study, These vitamin D deficient infants were 11 times more likely to develop a life-altering peanut allergy.
11 times. We aren't talking about a 10% or 20% bump in risk. We're talking about an 1,100% increase in the likelihood of a child having to carry an EpiPen for the rest of their life.
It's monumental.
If you were a parent dealing with a child's food allergy, you know exactly the kind of psychological terror that entails. The constant paranoid reading of every food label, the fear of cross-contamination at a birthday party, the sheer dread of eating at a restaurant. To think that a simple sunshine vitamin deficiency in the first year of life could increase that specific nightmare scenario by an order of magnitude, it fundamentally changes how you view public health.
It forces us to take a hard, uncomfortable look at how our modern lifestyles are actively fighting against human biology.
How so?
Well, our species evolved living near the equator, spending our days outdoors, hunting and foraging, naturally synthesizing massive, steady amounts of vitamin D through sun exposure. Today, infants are born inside hospitals, driven home in shaded cars, kept largely indoors, heavily clothed, and aggressively shielded from direct sunlight.
Which perfectly explains the fascinating geographic and seasonal links that the sources mention. Epidemiologists have noted for years that kids born in the autumn or winter months, when the days are dramatically shorter and the angle of the sun makes UVB radiation too weak to penetrate the atmosphere, have significantly higher rates of food allergies.
Exactly. The winter babies are at higher risk.
And the same exact trend applies to populations living at higher latitudes. If you live further away from the equator, in places like Scandinavia, Canada, or the northern United States, the ambient sunlight is weaker, and your regional allergy rates climb exponentially.
It's a massive epidemiological footprint that covers the entire globe. The sheer lack of ambient UVB radiation directly correlates with a biological failure to adequately program the infant immune system toward tolerance. We are inadvertently starving the regulatory systems, resulting in the explosive food allergy epidemic we are desperately struggling to manage today.
So we've seen how this breakdown happens on the outside barrier of the skin and on the inside barrier of the gut. But there is a third massive interface where we are constantly exposed to the outside world, the respiratory system.
The lungs.
We are swallowing food allergens, but we are breathing in environmental allergens, pollen, mold, dust mites, pet dander, with literally every single breath we take.
Let's look at the lungs and airways, starting with asthma. We usually think of asthma as just a localized allergic reaction that makes the lungs tight, but the sources reveal it is a deeply complex gene-environment interaction.
It is fundamentally a disease of architecture and genetics intersecting with the environment. Asthma is clinically characterized by a chronic underlying airway inflammation, extreme hyperreactivity of the smooth muscle tissue that wraps around the airways, and the excessive choking production of mucus.
Right, but there's a genetic piece.
Yes, the genetic component driving this is utterly fascinating, particularly when we zoom in on chromosome 17. I want to spend some time digging into this because genetics can sound incredibly abstract to a layperson, but this is a very physical structural issue. The sources highlight that the specific gene responsible for building the vitamin D receptor, the VDR gene, physically sits on chromosome 17.
Yes, and this is where we have to introduce the concept of genetic polymorphisms.
Polymorphisms, what are those?
A polymorphism is essentially a small, naturally occurring mutation or variation in the spelling of your DNA sequence. The research specifically zeroes in on a well-documented polymorphism known as the A allele, located in the VDR-CDX2 region, which geneticists have formally cataloged as RS11568820.
Okay, let's translate that barcode for the listener. What does possessing this specific A allele actually do to a human being's body?
It physically alters the structure of the promoter region of the VDR gene. You can think of the promoter region as the runway lights or the ignition switch for the gene.
Ignition switch.
It tells the cellular machinery where to land and start reading the instructions to build the receptor. If you inherit the specific A allele polymorphism, the ignition switch is slightly warped. It does not bind its transcription primers efficiently.
So it struggles to turn on.
Ultimately, this spelling error modifies how effectively the vitamin D receptor is actually built and expressed in your lung tissues. Even if you are taking massive supplements and have plenty of vitamin D circulating in your blood, your lung cells physically cannot hear the chemical signal as effectively because the cellular antenna itself is structurally compromised.
Wow.
Having this specific genetic variation drastically and mathematically increases your physical risk of developing severe asthma.
It's like having the exact right key for your house, but someone changed the shape of the deadbolt just enough that it gets sticky and won't turn.
That's a perfect way to put it.
But for the vast majority of people who don't have that specific mutation, how does optimal vitamin D actually physically help the lungs breathe easier?
When active vitamin D successfully binds to healthy receptors in the lungs, it operates directly on the airway's smooth muscle cells. During a terrifying asthma attack, these bands of muscle violently spasm and contract, squeezing the delicate airways shut.
Which is why they can't breathe.
Vitamin D actively reduces the force and frequency of this contraction. It forces the muscle to relax. Simultaneously, it limits the goblet cells from overproducing thick mucus, preventing the already narrowed airways from getting completely plugged.
So it addresses both the muscle spasm and the mucus.
Furthermore, it regulates the lungs by altering the expression of specific microRNAs.
MicroRNAs. These are tiny, non-coding pieces of RNA that float around and essentially turn other genes on and off, right? The notes mention one specific sequence, HSAMER 143.3P.
That is correct. MicroRNAs are like the master volume dials for gene expression. The levels of these specific microRNAs, which are highly influenced by vitamin D status, are so intimately tied to the inflammatory state of the airway tissue that researchers can actually sample them and use them to accurately predict the statistical likelihood of a patient requiring future hospitalizations for severe asthma exacerbations.
Boy, they can predict it.
It functions as a molecular crystal ball for predicting asthma severity.
That is incredible. A crystal ball in your blood. Now, let's move up from the deep lungs and look at the upper respiratory tract. Allergic rhinitis, commonly known as hay fever.
The bane of springtime?
The endless runny nose, the violent sneezing fits, the red, itchy, swollen eyes. The sources note that this miserable condition affects an estimated 1 in 6 individuals globally, and there is compelling clinical data showing that supplementing a patient with just 1,000 IU of vitamin D daily for 30 straight days can significantly lower their total nasal symptom score, or TNSS.
Yes, the TNSS is a standardized clinical metric we use to quantify the daily severity of nasal congestion, sneezing, itching, and rhinorrhea, which is the medical term for a relentlessly runny nose.
So lower is better.
Achieving a statistically significant reduction in a patient's TNSS means you have provided a massive tangible improvement in their daily quality of life, their ability to sleep, and their ability to focus at work or school.
But here is where the story gets really twisted. And frankly, I love when this happens in scientific literature because it forces us to think harder. The data for allergic rhinitis is absolutely not a straight line.
Not at all.
We just discussed studies showing clear, measurable benefits from supplementation. But then I'm looking at other parts of the source stack, specifically massive population-level studies that flat out contradict the positive findings.
The big population studies often do.
There are immense Mendelian randomization studies conducted on vast European populations alongside a gargantuan Korean cross-sectional study tracking over 15,000 adults that found absolutely zero association between vitamin D deficiency and allergic rhinitis. None. No benefit from having it, no risk from lacking it. Why is the scientific method contradicting itself so blatantly here?
This is the classic hair-pulling frustration of nutritional and epidemiological research. It comes down to the immense, chaotic complexity of studying massive human populations. First, we have the genetic variations we just discussed.
The polymorphisms.
Right. If you study a specific ethnic population that has a high underlying prevalence of VDR polymorphisms, giving them a supplement won't show the same linear benefit because their receptors are blunted. But the second, and arguably more critical reason for these contradictions is that baseline levels matter enormously.
When you say baseline levels, you mean the amount of vitamin D a person naturally had in their blood before they ever enrolled in the study or took the pill?
Precisely. Let's say you design a study and you recruit a patient who is profoundly, dangerously deficient in vitamin D. If you give them a supplement, you are going to witness dramatic, life-altering improvements in their immune function and a massive drop in their allergy symptoms.
Right, because you fixed the deficit.
But if you run that exact same study on a different population, say a group of healthy adults in Korea who already spend time outdoors and eat a diet rich in fish, meaning they already have relatively sufficient baseline levels, giving them an extra supplement will do absolutely nothing.
It just washes out.
You will not see a massive reduction in disease prevalence because the system isn't broken.
To use a car analogy, it's about the gas tank. If my car's gas tank is completely bone dry empty, you pour a gallon of gas into it, it's a miracle. The engine roars to life, the car drives, the problem is solved.
Right.
But if my gas tank is already 95% full and you pour another gallon of gas into it, The car isn't going to magically drive any faster or smoother. Adding gas to a full tank does nothing.
That is the perfect way to understand it. A nutrient supplement only acts as a therapeutic drug if the body is actively suffering from a biological deficit of that specific tool. If the tank is full, the intervention fails to show a result, and the study concludes no association.
Which brilliantly explains why the data is so muddy. But it also brings us to a scenario where the immune system's gas tank is definitely empty and the engine is completely misfiring and tearing itself apart. I want to talk about the loophole in the immune system.
Okay, let's go there.
The scenario where the body gets stuck in a chronic loop of misery. We're talking about chronic urticaria.
Urticaria is simply the clinical medical term for hives. Now, acute hives are incredibly common and usually harmless. You eat a weird strawberry, you pet a dog you're allergic to, you break out in a horribly itchy rash, but your immune system clears it up and it goes away in a few days.
Annoying, but temporary.
But chronic urticaria is a completely different, deeply frustrating and agonizing biological beast.
The strict clinical definition of chronic urticaria, or CU, is experiencing hives that occur daily or almost daily for a minimum of 6 straight weeks. Try to imagine that. 6 continuous weeks of relentless, burning, agonizing itching that covers your body, ruins your sleep, and makes you want to tear your skin off. It literally drives patients to the brink of insanity. What is actually malfunctioning in the body when a standard acute case of hives gets stuck in this endless chronic loop?
What researchers have discovered is that in many of these chronic patients, the immune system has actually crossed a terrifying threshold. It has transitioned from a simple, environmentally triggered allergic reaction into a full-blown autoimmune disease.
Autoimmune, so it's attacking itself.
Yes. Studies show that up to 30% of patients suffering from chronic urticaria are actively generating something called IgG autoantibodies.
Let's define autoantibodies. These are antibodies that have lost their way. They aren't attacking a foreign invader like pollen or a virus. They are actively hunting and attacking your own healthy body tissue.
Yes. And in the case of chronic urticaria, what these autoantibodies are targeting is incredibly specific and deeply problematic. The IgG autoantibodies target and physically bind to the actual IgE receptors located on the surface of the patient's own mast cells.
Wait, they bind to the receptors themselves.
By binding directly to these receptors, the autoantibodies act like a permanent, glued-down on switch. They aggressively force the mast cells to continuously degranulate, violently dumping massive amounts of histamine into the skin tissue day after day, week after week, completely regardless of whether any actual external allergen is present in the environment.
That has nothing to do with what they are eating or breathing anymore. It's like the immune system is a car alarm that has suffered a catastrophic short circuit. There is no burglar, nobody even bumped the bumper, but the siren is just screaming at top volume 247 and the out switch is broken.
Yeah.
How exactly does a vitamin D deficiency factor into this autoimmune nightmare?
Clinical immunologists observed a deeply fascinating progression risk. It appears that a severe baseline deficiency in vitamin D might be the critical biological trigger that allows the immune system to slip from an acute temporary reaction into this permanent chronic autoimmune loop.
The deficiency is the trigger.
One pivotal study tracked patients suffering from standard acute hives. They found that if a patient's vitamin D levels were severely deficient, meaning they measured below 10 nanograms per milliliter, which is a state of profound physiological depletion, a full 50% of those patients transitioned into chronic urticaria.
Half of them, half of the severely deficient patients got permanently stuck in the loop simply because their immune system lacked the master switch required to hit the brakes and shut the alarm off.
That's what the data suggests.
That strongly implies that if you catch the hives early and aggressively correct the deficiency, you might prevent the chronic autoimmune disease from ever taking root. But what about the people who are already trapped? The people who have been suffering for months or years? The sources detail a specific, radical clinical intervention called the megadose study, conducted by Boon Piathad and colleagues. And the numbers they achieved here are wild.
They truly are. The research team took a cohort of desperate patients suffering from severe, intractable chronic urticaria who were also confirmed to be deficient in vitamin D. They instructed the patients to continue taking their standard cocktail of antihistamine therapies, but they added a massive, highly aggressive clinical intervention.
What was the intervention?
They administered 300,000 international units of vitamin D per month.
I need to put that number in context for you listening because it's staggering. If you go to the pharmacy and buy a standard over-the-counter daily vitamin D supplement, it is usually dosed at all 1,000 or maybe 2,000 IU. 300,000 IU a month breaks down to roughly 10,000 IU every single day. That is a massive pharmacological megadose. What happened to the patients?
After 3 months of this megadose therapy, the clinical results were astounding. The hives, the swelling, the relentless itching completely disappeared in 61% of the treated patients.
61% completely cured.
Not just a minor improvement, but total symptomatic resolution. Furthermore, the researchers tracked the patient's progress using the DLQI, the Dermatology Life Quality Index.
Right, checking their quality of life.
This index thoroughly assesses how the skin disease is actively destroying the patient's life. It measures sleep loss, crushing anxiety, the inability to wear certain clothing, and severe social isolation. The DLQI scores in the megadose group showed massive, statistically significant improvements across the board compared to the control group.
That massive pharmacological hammer of vitamin D finally found the right frequency to disarm that blaring car alarm. It forced the short-circuiting immune system back into a state of tolerance and successfully shut down the production of those friendly fire autoantibodies. It is an incredibly hopeful therapeutic result for people who have been told there is no cure.
It is a phenomenal outcome, but it also leads us directly into a vital, necessary word of clinical caution. Because when a listener hears a miraculous story like that, the immediate, logical human instinct is to think, well, if a little vitamin D is good and a massive dose cured those agonizing hives, then I should just take a massive handful of vitamin D pills every single day to make my immune system completely bulletproof against all allergies.
And that instinct brings us to a massive pitfall, the Goldilocks paradox and the profound importance of supplementation timing. Because human biology is never a straight line, and more is definitely not always better.
Exactly the opposite, in fact. The biological relationship between vitamin D and the immune system operates on what epidemiologists call a U-shaped curve.
Let's break down the mechanics of the U-shaped curve for the listener.
If you take a graph and plot the risk of allergic markers, for instance, the total levels of IgE antibodies in a patient's blood on the vertical axis, and you plot their vitamin D blood levels on the horizontal axis, the resulting data points form the shape of a capital letter U.
Okay, visualizing a U.
On the far left side of the graph, when a patient's vitamin D levels are dangerously low, say less than 25 nanomoles per liter, their IgE levels are sky high. The allergy risk is highly elevated, as we've discussed. But as you move to the right into the middle sufficient zone, which is generally between 50 and 100 nanomoles per liter, the IgE levels plunge to their lowest possible point. That is the bottom of the U.
But then what happens if you get greedy and keep pushing the numbers further to the right with those massive daily megadoses?
If you aggressively push those blood levels too high, typically above 135 nanomoles per liter, the curve dramatically swings right back up. High levels of vitamin D are suddenly associated with elevated IgE and increased allergic sensitization.
So too much is just as bad.
At highly elevated levels, vitamin D stops acting like a soothing peacekeeper and becomes biologically toxic. It stresses the system, alters calcium metabolism in dangerous ways, and can dysregulate the immune system just as badly as a severe deficiency. You have to actively hunt for the Goldilocks zone. Not too little, not too much, but exactly right.
And here is the real kicker. It isn't just about the dosage amount. It is profoundly about the timing of when the developing body actually receives that molecule. This is where the pediatric clinical literature becomes an absolute minefield of frustrating contradictions. Let's explore the timing paradox. We have two entirely different critical developmental windows for a human being, pregnancy and early infancy.
This specific timing issue is one of the most fiercely debated areas in all of pediatric immunology. The data on maternal dietary intake is actually relatively consistent and clear.
Okay, so what does that data show?
Major longitudinal studies demonstrate that robust, adequate maternal dietary intake of vitamin D during the 9 months of pregnancy actively reduces the statistical risk of the child developing early childhood wheezing and severe food allergies. The mother's adequate nutritional status helps gracefully program the fetal immune system toward lifelong tolerance while the child is still developing in utero.
Okay, so that makes logical sense. Pregnant mothers getting enough natural vitamin D protects the baby's future immune system. But what happens after the baby is actually born? Because the source stack explicitly highlights major studies by researchers that looked at giving vitamin D directly to the infants.
And this is where the paradox emerges and confounds expectations. Those massive longitudinal studies found that direct daily supplementation of newborn infants with isolated vitamin D drops was actually statistically associated with a significantly increased risk of those children developing atopic eczema and allergic rhinitis by the time they reached adulthood.
Wait, hold on. Let me make sure I've got this straight. Maternal vitamin D naturally protects the baby in the womb, but taking a dropper and giving the baby isolated vitamin D directly after birth actually increases their allergy risk decades later. How does the scientific community possibly reconcile that massive contradiction?
To solve the paradox, researchers had to look past the molecule itself and examine the physical mechanism of delivery and the chemical formulation, which brings us to the breakthrough insights of the Cull study.
The Cull study, right?
The Cull study rigorously investigated how the specific formulation of the infant supplement physically altered the immune outcomes. They discovered that infants who were given standard water-soluble vitamin D supplements had a significantly increased risk of developing allergic diseases.
Water-soluble.
However, infants who were given vitamin D that was dissolved in a lipid matrix, specifically peanut oil, did not demonstrate that increased allergic risk.
Water-soluble versus fat-soluble. Why would the carrier liquid matter so profoundly to the immune system?
It comes down to evolutionary biology. Vitamin D is intrinsically, fundamentally, a fat-soluble molecule. In the natural world, human beings acquire it by synthesizing it slowly over hours through the lipid layers of our skin via steady sunlight exposure.
Right.
Or we consume it bound up tightly in the complex animal fats of wild fish or egg yolks. Our digestive tracts, our bile salts, and our highly sensitive immune sensors evolved over millions of years to process this specific molecule slowly in the natural presence of complex dietary lipids.
So when pharmaceutical companies isolate the molecule in a lab, strip away all the natural fats, chemically alter it to make it water-soluble, and then drop it directly onto the highly naive, rapidly developing mucosal immune system of a newborn infant's gut,
we are likely creating a deeply unnatural, highly concentrated chemical spike. It acts as an aggressive chemical signal that physically shocks the delicate local immune tissue of the gut rather than gently and slowly regulating it.
like a shock to the system.
It is the biological difference between a slow, steady, nourishing IV drip and a sudden, massive, overwhelming injection. The human body is exquisitely designed to handle the slow, steady synthesis of this hormone from the sun and whole foods. It is not necessarily evolved to handle isolated, highly concentrated chemical drops suddenly hitting an immature gut lining.
It's all about context.
Exactly. The Cull study synthesizes the complexity perfectly. The effect on the immune system is entirely dependent on the source food and sun versus a manufactured pill, the formulation natural fat-soluble versus artificial water-soluble, and the critical timing slow programming in utero versus aggressive postnatal exposure.
So what does this all mean for you listening? We have journeyed all the way from the physics of an invisible UV photon striking a cholesterol molecule in your skin to the revelation of portable manufacturing plants operating inside your microscopic immune cells.
It's a huge journey.
We have seen how active vitamin D acts as a masterful molecular traffic cop, forcefully pulling aggressive, inflammatory SWAT team macrophages into a peaceful healing mode, waving those highly destructive eosinophils out of the tissue, and massively boosting the peacekeeping regulatory T cells to maintain systemic tolerance against harmless things like peanuts and pollen.
And we have also traced the dark side of this biology. We've seen how the failure of this regulatory system leads to a catastrophic breakdown of the physical barriers in the skin and the gut.
The leaky barriers.
This structural failure opens the floodgates to the atopic march, mathematically increasing the terrifying risk of severe peanut allergies by 11 times, and allowing a simple case of acute hives to short-circuit and lock into an agonizing chronic autoimmune loop.
And crucially, we have learned that we cannot just biohack this intricate system with massive handfuls of pills whenever we feel like it. The U-shaped curve demands respect. It means respecting the profound complexity of your own body. Before you start pounding massive supplements because you are tired of dealing with seasonal allergies, you have to know where your biological gas tank is actually sitting. Get your blood levels of 25-OHD formally checked by a doctor. Aim for that sufficient middle ground, that Goldilocks zone, and try to get it in the form your body evolved to recognize.
It is ultimately an attempt to restore a lost evolutionary balance. Our biology absolutely requires this regulatory input, but it requires it in the right context, at the correct dosage, and ideally in the natural forms our bodies spent millions of years adapting to process.
I'll leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought to mull over. For decades, public health messaging has relentlessly hammered into us to slather on high SPF sunscreen, avoid the midday rays, and stay safely indoors to protect our skin from the very real dangers of UV damage and cancer.
It's what we're all taught.
But our incredibly complex immune systems evolved over millions of years outdoors, expecting a daily substantial dose of sunshine to literally program its regulatory cells to tolerate the world around us. Are our modern climate-controlled indoor lives and our deep, heavily medicated fear of the sun accidentally trading a localized decrease in skin cancer for a massive global epidemic of immune systems that are fundamentally violently allergic to the very world we live in?
It is the ultimate diagnostic muddy water. In our modern rush to fix one specific problem, we may have inadvertently starved the master switch of our entire immune system.
We thought it was just a simple calcium molecule. We thought the x-ray was clean and the diagnosis was simple. But as we have seen today in this deep dive, the reality is far deeper, far more complex, and infinitely more fascinating. Until next time, keep diving deep.